Washoe County Library System welcomes you to our weekly series, Artown Tuesdays, presented by the Nevada Historical Society. This afternoon's topic is the American Mountain Men with Larry Walker. My name is Samantha, and I'm so very happy to be here with you today. And now I would like to introduce Linda Burke with the Nevada Historical Society.
Thank you, Samantha. Good afternoon. I'm Linda Burke, Vice President of the Docent Council, a volunteer group at the Nevada Historical Society, Nevada's oldest cultural institution, located on the University of Nevada, Reno campus, and now open Wednesday to the public and Thursday and Friday by appointment. Our speaker today is Larry Walker, and he is an American mountain man. This organization studies and reenacts the lifestyle and equipment of the fur trappers of the American West. Larry is keenly interested in the firearms of the late 18th and early 19th century and builds recreations of the J.J. Henry trade rifles that were most commonly used by the mountaineers. He will speak on the beaver trappers of the fur trade era and illustrate how the American mountain men research and teach the skills and history of these important pathfinders. Larry has recently helped in the production of an educational video on this topic for the Nevada Historical Society. Please welcome Larry Walker.
Well, good morning, everybody. I have a disclaimer to start with, and that is that I am not a historian. I'm simply a student of the history of the Western expansion of North America. So if there's a few little mistakes in my presentation, don't hold it against Pam. Anyway, we're going to look at the first Euro-Americans to explore the Great Basin. And actually, this exploration is really the tail end of a much bigger story, and that is what is popularly known as the fur trade era of North America, which basically runs from 1800 to 1840, maybe 1850. But it's the trapping of the Missouri after the Lewis and Clark expedition. And so why were they there? They were here because of the high value of pelts, in particular the beaver, whose fur was used in the making of hats since the early 1300s. And beaver had been trapped into extinction in Europe by the early 1600s and was being trapped in North America from about 1535 by the French. From about 1600 to 1850, an average of 100,000 pelts were annually being taken from North America. And the English Hudson's Bay Company dominated the trade in northern Canada and in the Oregon territories. In 1810, John Jacob Astor, an American, set up Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River, which later he sold to the Northwest Company out of fears of the upcoming War of 1812. The Northwest Company was eventually merged with the HBC. The first man credited with crossing the Great Basin is Jed Smith. In 1826, he left the rendezvous in Cache Valley, leading a group of 15 men down the Virgin River along the Sietskadee, or the Green, into the Colorado, to the Mojave Indian villages. And from there, he traveled west across the Mojave Desert and then across the San Bernardino Mountains to the Mexican mission at San Gabriel. After having problems with the Spanish governor, who thought they were spies sent to spy on what was going on in California, he told them they had to leave by the route they came from, which he did not do. He traveled north along the west flank of the Sierra Nevadas. And he was seeking the Rio Buenaventura, and it was long rumored to be a river that ran from the Great Salt Lake to the Pacific Ocean and dumped out around San Francisco. Anyway, he left all but 2 of his men, and they camped along the Stanislaus River, and he and his 2 companions crossed the snowbound Sierras to join his business partners at the 1827 rendezvous at the south end of Bear Lake in what is now Utah. His route back across the Great Basin followed pretty closely to what is now Highway 50, and then he veered north up by the Great Salt Lake. Anyway, he got back to the rendezvous at Bear Lake, which is in what is now Utah, and he left within 10 days and took basically the same route with an additional 18 men. Well, by the time he got down to the Mojave Indians again, in the meantime, between his first and his second trip, they'd had a run-in with a trapper out of Santa Fe by the name of Ewing Young. And there had been a scrap and some people killed. And so when he got half his men across the river, being Jed Smith, the Mojaves attacked, and I believe they killed 10 of his group. The men of the Hudson's Bay Company, in particular Peter Skeen Ogden and later John Wirt, they were probably the first to capitalize on trapping in Nevada, and in particular the Humboldt River and its tributaries. In 1828 and 29, they led an expedition into the Great Basin from the north, and came in around Winnemucca, what is now Winnemucca, and found the Marys River, or the Unknown River. And that's a whole talk in itself, all the different names that what became the Humboldt was used. And they trapped there. And the Hudson's Bay Company had Sandwich Islanders with them. And on one incident, 3 Sandwich Islanders were sent south out of Idaho to explore a river, and they never turned up again. It's believed they were killed by Indians. But the river was named the Oahe, and we have the Oahe Desert, which was kind of an American bastardization of what the Sandwich Islanders called their homeland, or Hawaii. And they were called Kanakas, which is the Hawaiian word for workers. John Jacob Astor was the first trader to bring Kanakas to North America because they were good paddlers and good swimmers. And his original business plan was to set up trading posts up the Columbia, and then have ships moving up and down the Pacific coast. And so he wanted good swimmers and paddlers. Milton Sublette was another to travel down the Oahe River into the Humboldt. And Joseph Meek was with him. And they ran into a real problem because the beaver along the Humboldt, this was later, had eaten most of the willow. So they'd been feeding on parsnip, wild parsnip. Well, that made their flesh poisonous. And because of the lack of game along the Humboldt, the trappers were forced to eat the beaver meat, and they became very sick. Joe Meek tells a story of sticking his hand in an anthill and waiting for the ants to cover his hand and then licking the ants off of his hand just for some protein. In 1833, Joseph Walker was put in command of a party sent by Benjamin Bonneville to the Great Salt Lake. And he was to find a land, or preferably a water route, again, the Buenaventura, to California. His clerk, Zenas Leonard, described the Humboldt and the people there as barren. And he named the river the Barren River. And I'm a member of the Barren River Party of the American Mountain Men. They traveled along the Humboldt to its sink, and from there to present-day Genoa, and ascended the Sierras along the West Fork of the Carson River. On their return from California, they crossed the mountains further south near present-day Tehachapi, and then up to Owens Valley. They tried to head east, but after finding it difficult to find water, They went backtracked, and then continued north up to the Humboldt Sink to return by their previous route. In 1840, Walker and his band made the first north-south crossing of the Great Basin to the Virgin River, then to the Colorado, and then across the Mojave to LA, where he was trading for horses. In 1843, he led the first wagon train to California by his previous route along the Humboldt and to the Sink, and that became the California Trail. He then traveled south to Owens Lake, where they were forced to abandon their wagons, and they went across the southern Sierra Nevada and eventually to the Salinas Valley. There's a guy who shows up all the time in the history of the fur trade from the very early days, about 1809, by the name of Caleb Greenwood, or Old Greenwood. In 1844, at the age of 81, Greenwood guided the Stevens Townsend Murphy party across the Sierras at what is now Donner Pass. And these were the first wagons ever to cross the Sierra Nevada. Now, James Beckwourth, he was kind of a notorious mountain man. There's an autobiography, but it was actually, he told it to, I can't remember the author's name now, and she wrote it all down. He was known as a gaudy liar. He was a great storyteller, and so his autobiography is to be read with a bag of salt. But an important man in the history of the fur trade. And in about 1851, he was headed towards California to get into the gold, mining thing. And he explored the Sierra between the Middle Fork of the Feather River and Truckee, and found a route that he thought would be better for wagons, and that's Beckwourth Pass, just north of us. And he set up a store in Sierra Valley where he would resupply pioneers coming west. Well, I can't leave out John C. Fremont and his guide, Kit Carson. They made 5 explorations to the west, the second of which in 1843-44 brought them into northern Nevada. And after successfully searching a trail to the Pacific via the Columbia River. And here they, quote, discovered Pyramid Lake. And while crossing the Sierras, following the river that Fremont later named for Carson, they were among the first Americans to see Lake Tahoe. Now, after traveling down through Central Valley of California, they picked up the trail blazed by Jed Smith and went back across the Mojave to the old Spanish Trail to Santa Fe. Now we're going to see a short film that was made by the National Geographic magazine. They were shooting an article for the magazine and attended a couple of camps put on by members of the American Mountain Men. And actually, we were barely aware that they were videotaping too, and some interviews. And I thought it was just for reference. Had no idea they were going to make this film, but so we'll show that now, Carol. Men went to the mountains to get rich. Probably more of them died than survived, and certainly more died than got rich. It was sort of the end of the discovery era of North America. Now he's living his later days. The traders are the ones that made the most money out of it. They were pathfinders. They were exploring new, uncharted territory. I'm a member of the AMM, American Mountain Men. The AMM is an invitation-only group. And I think what has drawn most of us to it is most of us started out going to Mountain Man rendezvous. The guys that moved on to the AMM were people that were more interested in really learning the day-to-day life. It was a full-time job surviving. Well, the AMM brings a wide variety of people from all walks of life to it, and they all bring something different.
Simplicity, the connection with the earth, the animals, the non-garbage, non-complicated, dependent on only yourself and your own skills. It's a freedom, a unique freedom.
If you ask any of us what our most precious feeling that we have out here and on the trail is the feeling of pure freedom.
To have ridden as a mountain man over the plains.
It's interesting, it's just the common thirst for the knowledge of how they lived, and we all learn from one another. Things like just being warm, simple things that we take for granted today. They didn't write about that in their journals because they just assumed everybody knew how to make fire. The sort of Hollywood version of the lone trapper is not the mainstream. They trapped in brigades, and that was for survival. Most of these guys didn't get rich doing this. Most of them, by the time Rendezvous was over, they had spent everything they made.
At these going for $4 to $6 a piece in the old days of Rendezvous, a good trapper would come in and be able to cash in for anywhere up to $1,000, $1,200 worth of goods. They did not exchange money. They were exchanging this and bartering for goods that were brought out from St. Louis.
And it was the finest felt for making hats, and it was very fashionable, and it was very profitable. The technology of the day is one of the things that fascinates me. The tools that they made that are, by today's standards, very crude, they were able to turn out precision working parts. One thing that a lot of people may not realize is mountain men didn't have ammunition. When you went to trade, you trade for raw material. You could get your powder and you could get lead. And then you would have a ladle and you would heat the lead over your campfire and melt it and then pour it into the ladle. And that's called running ball.
We're living a vestige of American history through our eyes. We're reliving it and hopefully bringing it alive for people in today's world in a way that perhaps they're not taught in school because it's not written about exactly the way it was.
Be the last of the last.
Hell, I was there and I know so were you.
As it said in the little film, I'm a member of the American Mountain Men, and the slide up on the screen right now is basically our objectives and our code. This is an invitation-only group, and what we do is we go out in the wilderness and hunt and trap, camp as the original mountaineers did, with tools and equipment of the 1800 to 1840 period. So this requires research on our part from primary source journals, paintings, manifests from the trading companies. And there's relatively few journals from the day, first-person journals. But more information is turning up all the time, along with some of the manifests and that are being uncovered by historians. And so these manifests help give us a pretty good idea, or a very good idea, of the trade goods and equipment that left St. Louis for the upper Missouri trade. And so we use that a lot, and also paintings by Alfred Jacob Miller. He's the only artist ever to actually go to a rendezvous. Now, most of us were recruited from a modern day buckskinning rendezvous. And these are a family-oriented, they're camps, trade fair, black powder shooting events, archery events. And they're a loose interpretation of the original Mountain Man rendezvous. The Mountain Man rendezvous of the Upper Missouri were started by William Ashley, and he formed the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. And his first forays into the mountains, there was always a problem getting the furs back to market. And rather than having trappers travel all the way back to St. Louis to resupply and get trade goods, he came up with the rendezvous system where men would stay in the mountains for a couple of years. They would winter up there, and that way they would be there for the fall and the spring hunt when the pelts were the best. And Ashley would transport all the peltries back to St. Louis and sell them. Well, he figured out also that that's where the money was. It wasn't up there trapping, it was being the supplier. Okay, now here's a couple of pictures of some of the equipment. Everything you see here was made by myself and other members of the American Mountain Men. On the left, you see some different guns that we built, powder horns. I think there's a bait bottle and a bullet bag on the left. On the right, there's a hooped beaver pelt. That white thing in the middle is a beaver skull. Just to the right of that is a hand-forged beaver trap that's been copied after an original, and then a knife, and there's probably a ball mold in there. The original fur companies, they weren't licensed to trap. They were licensed to trade with the Indians and not trap. But it was quickly evident that the tribes weren't going to supply enough pelts to meet the demand. So trapping brigades were formed. And these brigades had a loose military-like structure of 100 or more men. And they were broken down into parties. And the parties would go out in different directions and trap different streams and tributaries. And then within the parties, there'd be messes. And a mess would be 3 or 4 guys that would camp together and cook together and sleep together. In all this, you had a captain or bourgeois, and there's the American bastardization of that as a bourgeois. He was in charge of things either at a fort or if they're out in the field, the term was partisan. And he ran everything. He sent the parties out in different directions, and he was like a military leader. He had to organize everything. And then you also had a clerk, and the clerk was probably the second most important man in the brigade. You might have more than one clerk because, well, they kept the books and the ledgers, and sometimes they ran the trade meetings with the Indians. But they kept the ledgers of all the trade goods that were brought and each individual's account, because the trappers would trade for pelts, as you learned in the film, not for money. And a trapper may be an engagee who's employed by the company or even under almost a slave agreement where they had to work for them for 5 years, and where they were supplied with the traps, food, horse, and a yearly wage. Rarely did the wage pay them enough where they could sort of escape from this lifestyle. Sort of the top of the line was a free trapper, and he's one who had all his own gear and sold his pelts to the highest bidder. But he often traveled with one of the brigades just for safety reasons, or with a group of other free trappers. And also you had hunters that might double as trappers. They were to supply food for the brigade or for a fort. Camp keepers, they were kind of the bottom of the barrel. Their job was to pack everything up, move it, skin the beaver, stretch the hides, handle all that. The trappers just trapped. And then you had a blacksmith too. Here's just a couple of pictures of hunting. This is a guy who, on the left, Brad Bailey, took a deer with a rifle I built for him. And on the right, I'm just skinning out a deer that I took. And this is just a picture of a party of men on horseback. This was up in the Jarbidge Wilderness area, actually just this last summer. Now we have a slide of about trapping beaver. So the process of trapping beaver, the first thing is finding sign. Well, obviously a dam is a pretty good sign that there's beaver, or a lodge. But you're not always looking for that because like in the Truckee River, the beaver there don't dam up the river. And by the way, beaver are not indigenous to the Truckee River. They were planted there back in the 1920s. Guys thought it would be a great idea to have a beaver market, and they've done a great deal of damage to the trees along the Truckee River. But anyway, so what you do is you look for a sign along a place like the Truckee. You look for chewed willow branches, or a food raft, which is just willow branches that have been stuck in the bottom so they can come back when things ice over and get them. The picture in the lower left shows a slide where the beaver's been going in and out of the water. And you can see a trap there set in the shallow water. That trap has a chain on it. That chain goes out into deeper water where it's staked down. And also you'll notice along the edges of the trap, there's sticks have been driven in. That's to sort of guide the beaver onto the trap. Now, a beaver will often make what is called a scent mound, where he puts some of his own castor scent. He's marking his territory. So the way you get to bring him to trap is if you have your bait, which is made from the castor gland and the oil gland of the beaver. And sometimes they'd mix a little rum in there or some nutmeg just to make it more aromatic. And you dip a stick in that bait, and you stick that on the scent mound or on the slide. So the beaver will come up and stand to sniff it because he wants to see who's been invading his territory. He steps in that trap. Trap grabs his leg. He swims for deep water because that's where safety is. And the weight of the trap drowns him. And that was the old traditional way of trapping beaver. And you can do a dam set where you break a hole in the dam, the beaver will come to repair that hole, and you could do a set in a place like that too to catch them. Next thing is you skin the beaver and stretch the hide or hoop it. And here's a hooped beaver hide. And the illustration on the right is of a press for packing the pelts. You would fold the pelts hair into a square and compress them in a press like this, and then wrap them with rawhide. And then that way, that's how you would transport them. Transportation would be by bull boat, canoe, or by horse. And then if you could get them to the river where there's a keel boat, that's the most efficient way. This particular keel boat in the picture here was built by members of the, one member of the AMM back in 2019. And what these guys did was they retraced William Ashley's trip from the first rendezvous in 1825. They went by horse for 350 miles and then 100 to 200 miles along the Sweetwater River and the Yellowstone River down to the Missouri River, where they met up with this keel boat and traveled down the Missouri. They didn't go all the way to St. Louis because there's dams and all kinds of obstructions. And it turned out that in 2019, the river was in flood while this trip was being done. So it turned out to be a pretty dangerous undertaking because the river was so high. Whenever they try and go to the bank, they had to take the mast down and use grappling hooks, and the river was moving quickly, and it was a pretty scary deal. But nobody got hurt. Everybody made it. Okay, here you see a bull boat. Bull boat was basically just a framework made out of willows or saplings, something that was flexible that they could tie together, covered with the skin of a buffalo, a bull hide, The illustration on the left is of Indians using them, and the mountain men use them for river crossings. River crossings probably accounted for half of the deaths of the mountain men. Now, paddling one of these things is kind of a challenge because it's like being in a teacup. So they don't like to track very well. But sometimes they were made, and members of the American Mountain Men have made long cigar-shaped ones, more like a canoe. And you can actually carry a lot of gear in that. Typically, your camp would have been just an open camp, like you see on the right here, where you just roll out your bedroll with your feet to the fire. And, you know, as long as the weather's good. In inclement weather, you would set up a lean-to, or what we call a diamond shelter, just a piece of canvas to keep the rain or snow or dew off of you. If you're in scary country, as far as grizzly bears or marauding Indians, very often they would sleep in a wheel around the fire with your feet to the fire, and everybody's facing out away from the fire. That way you can sleep with your gun loaded. And so if something happens in the middle of the night, you're not going to shoot across the fire and shoot your buddy. The picture on the left, I'm sorry, was a winter camp. And in the winter, they would build kind of a rude cabin or lean-to. You can see here he's got all his traps hung up, some hides hung up. And so that way they could stay warmer. But you'd need something a little more substantial for the winter, but it wasn't fancy by any means. Not a cabin like we think of a cabin these days. Okay, there's no matches, so fires are all started with flint and steel or a bow drill. Cooking was done over an open fire. In a mess, you'd probably have a pot, cast iron pot, or a tin pot, a skillet. You'd use a tripod very often, or make some sort of a grill that you could roast meat on. Their diet was predominantly meat, buffalo being the favorite. But whenever they could find fruit, berries, edible plants, the Indians, a lot of the Indians grew squashes and melons. So you'd have that. Pemmican, which we've all heard of, was basically dried buffalo meat that had been ground up, mixed with some tallow or lard, and whatever berries might be available. I've had what has been described as really good pemmican, and it's just survival food. It's edible and appealing are two different things. Okay, now here's a tripod, a grill with fish being cooked on over it. The upper left picture, I think, that was buffalo heart, which was really good. And over the tripod is hanging a beaver tail. I have had beaver tail when it was good, but it usually tastes like butt. During trapping season, there wasn't much in the way of leisure time. Maybe smoke a pipe around the campfire in the evening. Your leisure time would have been during rendezvous, which turned into kind of a raucous party. There was shooting events or competitions and horse riding, and everybody bragging about how they were the biggest, toughest mountain man around. But during the winter time, there would be, you would be repairing your saddles, your horse gear, you're collecting firewood, and you'd be repairing traps and whatnot. But they had what they called Rocky Mountain colleges, where those that could read might read Shakespeare or the Bible, or whatever was in print in the day. A big part of the AMM is education. It's an important part of what we do. And we have people in all over the country and in Sweden and Denmark. But different parties will engage in public displays, lectures, and demonstrations. This picture here is of a demonstration at the La Purisma Mission, just in Lompoc, California, where every year in March, the state park has members of the AMM come down and do an encampment at the mission, and they bring in 1,000 fourth graders to tour it, and because they're learning about the missions at that time. So on the left here, Don Morgan is telling kids about the beaver hats. The middle picture is my friend Gary Brown. He's showing them blacksmithing skills. He's an incredible blacksmith. And then on the right, Larry Huber is showing some tourists how a firearm works. Probably our most ambitious work is being done at the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, Wyoming. I highly recommend a visit there if you find yourself in the neighborhood. It's a wonderful museum. And every year, Pinedale has what they call a rendezvous or Mountain Man Days, and it goes on for a weekend. Well, during that time, members of the American Mountain Men go and set up a camp adjacent to the museum to show people how we go out and camp. Everything of ours has to be documentable, down to the clothing, the fabrics used. Everything has to be hand sewn. The buckskins are preferably from deer that we've shot with our flintlock, and tanned in the way of the Plains Indians by brain tanning. So anyway, that's the end of that. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to take those.
Thank you very much, Larry. That's fascinating topics, and we do have a few questions. But first of all, I wanted to mention that at the beginning you said that you weren't a historian, and apologies to Pam. And I wanted to explain to everybody that Pam Walker is your wife, and she is the current president of the Docent Council at the Nevada Historical Society. And some of you may have heard her speak on the Humboldt River and its many names in our July 9th series of history talks at the Nevada Historical Society on Friday mornings. So that will be on the website in the future, that talk by Pam on the Humboldt River. So we have a few questions for you, Larry. So let me just scroll up for them. What were you doing when you were swinging that pail around at the camp on the National Geographic?
That was a coffee pot, and I was settling the grounds.
Right.
There's a couple things you can do. You can pour a little bit of cold water on the top, and that'll help settle the grounds. In that video, there was a shot of us roasting green coffee beans, and then put them in a bag, and with the top side of the tomahawk, I mashed them up as fine as I could get them, and then we just throw that in a pot of water. But I was just settling grounds. You want to be sure that your pot has really good bales on it. Otherwise, if that handle comes off, it could be ugly.
What does the coffee taste like?
Strong coffee.
Okay.
Never get all the grounds out. That's where a mustache helps.
Okay. What were those multi-sided glasses that you wore? Can you explain?
That is a pair of period shades. They were a trade item. I have a pair here. This is the pair I was wearing. And what they have is folding lenses. And so if it's real bright, you can fold those in and make it darker. The earpieces are hinged. They have a wang on them to keep it on your head. These don't go on the ears. Actually, they kind of just go up on the temples. It was believed in the 17th and 18th century that colored glass could help with certain diseases, syphilis being one of them. Here's another original pair. And from what I understand, in the advanced stages of syphilis, your eyes become very sensitive to light, so that you could wear them like this indoors, and then if you're going to go outdoors, you could fold the side lenses in.
Very interesting. Were there dogs with the trappers?
Yeah, there's, and I'm in the process of researching that. There's a few instances in first-person journals of dogs. One instance in Ferris's book, Life in the Rocky Mountains, where they were in the neighborhood of some Blackfoot Indians, and their dog was making noise, and they actually had to smother it to keep from being found. Now, the Indians had lots of dogs. They had lots of dogs before they had horses, and that's the way they moved to their camps. They had dog travois, and they would actually have a little herd of dogs pulling travois to move their camps. Now, once they got horses, they still had dogs. They were good for guarding the camp, good alarm system, plus they were a food item. They ate lots of dogs, and the mountain men ate dogs too when things got tough.
Okay. In the days when you didn't have social media or television or communication, phone, newspapers, how did you know about the rendezvous? How did the mountain men know where it was going to be? Was it set the year before, or?
Yeah, the year before, the mountain men were aware of certain areas that were good as far as availability of water and feed, because you had a lot of horses. At the first rendezvous, there was maybe 100 people. At the height of it, it was close to 1,000, because the Indians would come in and trade too. And you had these different competing fur companies that would all gather at the same spot. And there were certain areas called parks that were in large drainages where there was plenty of water, lots of feed for the horses, and they would have a pre-designated spot where they would meet at a certain time of the year, and it was usually around June and July. And so the first rendezvous was one day, but later they became as long as 2 weeks.
Right. Okay. And so where were they located now and in the past? Are they still similar areas that you meet today as well?
Well, the rendezvous, the muzzleloading group rendezvous can be anywhere. It used to be in California, there was one every weekend during the summer. But now there's only 4 or 5 clubs doing it. There's a fairly big one in Oregon or Washington or California called the Pacific Primitive every year. The American mountain men, whenever we do our rendezvous, it's always in the Rocky Mountains somewhere. But the area actually around Pinedale, Wyoming, where the Green River, where Horse Creek meets the Green River, there was 4 major rendezvous there. Wyoming, Utah, that's where most of them were.
Okay. And what qualifications do you need to have to be a member of the American Mountain Men?
Well, as I stated in the video, it's by invitation, and usually it's me as a member. Now, if I spot somebody at some camp or mountain man rendezvous that looks interesting and is trying to, as we say, do it right with all correct gear, we'll invite them to join us for some camps. And if they think it's a fit for them and we think they're a fit for the group, we'll invite them to join. And then they have 2 years to complete. There's a list of 20 requirements. And to become a full member, you have to complete 10 of them, 10 of your choice. And then if you want to reach the higher level of a Hiverano, which is a French word near as I can tell, it means a veteran of the mountains. You can finish the last 10. And there are requirements like having a full set of handmade clothes, handmade equipment. One of the more advanced ones is 3 days, go out with no food and water and live off the land. Traveling on horse, canoe, or foot as many miles as you can in 5 days. Just things like that, taking a big game animal with a flintlock, field dressing it, preparing the hide for market, trapping some fur-bearing animal and preparing the hide for market. Being able to start a fire with flint and steel in all 4 seasons in wet conditions or dry. Stuff like that.
Right. Do you have to be able to ride a horse?
No, you don't. But it's kind of most men that join the group, that's sort of the dream, is to be able to do a horse ride into a rendezvous. I've been lucky enough to do 2 week-long trips and another 4-day trip on horseback with all primitive gear. 2 of them in the Tetons and then 1 in the Jarbish Wilderness area in Nevada. But we have members that have ridden from, there's 3 members that have ridden from Mexico to Canada, all through the Rocky Mountains with all primitive gear.
Did the mountain men bring their own horses, or did they have to trade for them from the Indians, or how did they get their horses?
They would trade with the Indians for horses. Later on, they brought their own horses. They had a large remuda of horses. Each mountain man had at least a horse that he rode and a pack animal, but very often they would have a string of pack mules or horses carrying gear. For them to have over 100 horses in a brigade or 200 horses was not uncommon. If you weren't on a horse, you were looking for one. The Indians, that was a big sport of theirs, was stealing horses. And then became sport for the mountain men to steal them back. But that your horse was what kept you alive, because that's the only way you were going to cover this much ground, either that or float down the river.
Right. I've seen some pictures, and I'm not sure whether they were from that artist that you mentioned, of the mountain men having horse racing, and I've read about it too, at the rendezvous. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, well, they were going to compete in any of the skills that they had developed for survival. I mean, tomahawk throwing, knife throwing, arrow, shooting arrows, shooting your rifle, and it became quite a scene of debauchery once you had alcohol in large quantities.
Right. Okay, and another question: why did beaver hunting stop?
Well, beaver hunting, they had over-trapped to the extent where it was getting tougher and tougher. There was also duties and whatnot on imported goods. Trade goods became more expensive, and then silk hats came into fashion. But beaver is still used for hats today. This is 100% beaver felt hat. Most of the beaver fur that's being used for hats today is coming out of Brazil. Beaver here just doesn't pay. It's actually the castor is worth more than the pelt, because the castor is used in making perfumes.
Oh, right. What kind of perfumes? Any? Or all?
For people, yeah.
Yeah.
Because
okay.
if you harvest the castor and skin a beaver, you smell like that for a long time. You've all heard of musk oil. Well, that's from a muskrat. It's the same thing. It's the castor. And what it is, I guess the way it's used is as a carrier, because it gets into your skin and it will keep the scent on you.
Clean. Okay, and you have that peculiar wrap up from your hat.
Yeah.
Can you?
That hat band is made with flattened out porcupine quills. And the Indians would flatten the quill between their teeth and then dye them with natural dyes from plants and rocks and whatnot. And then sew it onto brain tanned leather. And they would decorate their clothing with it, straps, all sorts of things, even get into floral design. Some of the quill work is just fabulous. And there's a handful of people that are still doing it to a high degree. It's very expensive, and but it's an authentic way of doing things. The brain tan is called brain tan because when you tan a hide in the Plains Indian style, you scrape it, and then you actually use the brains of the animal, and you make a slurry out of that, and you work that into the hide. And the oil in the brains helps the hide from gluing itself back together and becoming stiff, and it becomes very soft, and then you just work it dry. So that's where the term "someone hasn't got enough brains to tan their own hide" comes from that.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Larry. It's been a really interesting conversation. And also, everybody, if you want to see some of Larry's rifles or some of the other artifacts that he mentions or uses in the video on this screen, the Nevada Historical Society has that Mountain Men video on the educational part of its website. And you actually demonstrate some of those things there, don't you, Larry?
Yeah.
I think. There too. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us today, and we hope to see you next week. Thank you, Larry and Washoe County Library and Carol and the tech John behind the scenes. I'll turn it over to you, Samantha.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Linda Burke, Carol Coleman, and Larry Walker with the Nevada Historical Society, and John, our Washoe County Library Service Tech Wizard, for making this event possible today. Don't forget to sign up for the next live event with Nevada Historical Society on Tuesday, July 27th at 3 p.m. The topic again will be Nevada military women with retired Lieutenant Colonel Ann Davis. To sign up, please visit events.washoecountylibrary.us. If you want to see what else is coming up, visit us at events.washoecountylibrary.us, where you can also access and download our Virtual Explorer, which is a publication listing of all our virtual events and resources. We'll see you next time. Bye.